At about 3 o'clock on April 19, 1775, a British column reached the eastern side of Lexington, Massachusetts, in serious disorder. Some of the soldiers were running instead of marching. Ammunition was running low. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith had been wounded, and exhausted light infantrymen could no longer protect every part of the road. Then the troops saw a fresh British brigade and 2 field guns waiting on the heights ahead. That relief force prevented a battlefield collapse. The larger question is how an expedition of elite troops had reached this condition after setting out from Boston less than 16 hours earlier. The answer was not a single ambush, a single commander, or superior marksmanship. It was a chain of problems that reinforced one another. British secrecy failed before the march began. Massachusetts alarm riders turned distance into time for mobilization. At Concord, a limited exchange of fire changed the political and military character of the day. On the return, the road repeatedly narrowed or bent through ground that weakened the British protective screen. The regulars remained dangerous and disciplined, but fatigue, casualties, and dwindling ammunition accumulated mile after mile. April 19 became a contest between professional organization and a countryside able to generate new armed resistance faster than the column could escape it. In the spring of 1775, General Thomas Gage held 2 positions at once. He was Royal Governor of Massachusetts and Commander-in-Chief of British forces in North America. Outside Boston, however, the Massachusetts Provincial Congress was assuming powers the royal government could no longer exercise. Towns were organizing militia, forming volunteer minute companies, and collecting powder, muskets, food, tents, and artillery. Concord, about 18 miles northwest of Boston, had become an important storage center. Gage chose a limited raid. His troops were to seize and destroy military supplies before those supplies could support a larger uprising. The force assembled for the mission was not an ordinary marching regiment. It drew 21 grenadier and light infantry companies from 11 regiments in the Boston garrison. Estimates vary, but about 700 men took the field under Lieutenant Colonel Smith, with Major John Pitcairn as another senior officer. Grenadiers were selected for size and steadiness. Light infantrymen were chosen for speed and trained to spread out, use cover, and protect a formation in broken country. Their short coats and leather caps suited that work. These soldiers were well prepared for a fight. They were less well placed for a secret 40-mile round trip through an alarmed population. The operation was compromised before the main body crossed the Charles River. Mounted British officers had already been observed on the road west of Boston. Patriot leader Joseph Warren learned that troops were moving and sent William Dawes by the land route and Paul Revere across the river. Their immediate task was to warn John Hancock and Samuel Adams at Lexington, then carry the alarm toward Concord. The familiar story of one rider obscures the system that mattered most. Riders alerted other riders. Bells, drums, and alarm guns summoned town companies. Messages moved along several roads, so stopping one messenger could not silence the countryside. Between 10 and 11 that night, the grenadiers and light infantry began crossing from Boston in boats. The transfer took hours. They landed at the Cambridge Marsh and waded through water that reached their knees. Lieutenant John Barker recorded that the men then waited in a dirty road for provisions. The temperature was near 36 degrees, and wet wool offered little comfort. The column did not begin marching until about 2 in the morning. The moon gave light, but it also made secrecy harder. Before Smith's men had covered much ground, they could hear the signals that told them the alarm was already spreading. Revere and Dawes reached Lexington around midnight and warned Hancock and Adams. They continued west with Dr. Samuel Prescott of Concord. A British patrol stopped Revere in Lincoln. Dawes also failed to reach Concord, but Prescott escaped the patrol and delivered the warning. Revere was later released and returned on foot toward Lexington, None of this depended on one flawless ride. By then, households and militia officers were passing the message outward. In Concord, Colonel James Barrett began moving or concealing stores that had not already been dispersed. In Lexington, Captain John Parker assembled his militia and told the men to remain ready. At about 4:30, Smith detached roughly 200 light infantrymen to move ahead more quickly and secure the Concord bridges. That decision answered a real tactical problem, but it also placed the fastest troops at the front of a column, already tired from the night march. Near 5:30, the advance entered Lexington. 77 members of Parker's company stood on the common. They were not blocking the only route through town, and Parker soon ordered them to disperse. British and American accounts disagree about commands and behavior in the confusion. They also leave the first shot unidentified. Once that shot sounded, British light infantry fired uneven volleys and advanced. The encounter lasted only minutes. 8 Lexington militiamen were killed and 10 wounded. The regulars then regained order and continued toward Concord. Later generations turned the Green into a simple scene with clear intentions on each side. The surviving evidence is less tidy. Parker stated days afterward that he had ordered his men not to fire. British officers believed they faced armed defiance. What can be said with confidence is that an uncertain shot produced an unmistakable result. Blood had been shed, and armed companies across Middlesex County now marched toward a conflict that was no longer hypothetical. The British reached Concord at about 7 in the morning. At first, the regulars outnumbered the local militia by roughly 3 to 1. Barrett's men withdrew through the town and across the North Bridge to higher ground near Punkatasset Hill, where reinforcements could join them. Smith secured Concord's center and both bridges, then divided his command for the search. 7 light infantry companies crossed the North Bridge. 4 continued toward Barrett's farm, while 3 companies, about 96 men under Captain Walter Lorry, remained near the bridge to keep the route open. Captain Lawrence Parsons brought about 120 men to the Barrett property. The searchers found little of military value. The colonists had received warnings before April 19 and had moved many stores to other communities. What remained had been carried away or concealed. In Concord Center, other British parties found and destroyed some supplies, including cannon carriage parts, tents, flour, and military equipment. The raid was therefore not entirely fruitless, but it did not eliminate the provincial stockpile. More important, every hour spent searching allowed additional militia companies to approach by farm lane, side road, and town road. By 9 o'clock, the provincial force west of the North Bridge had grown to about 400 men from Concord, Lincoln, Bedford, Acton, and other towns. From the high ground, they saw smoke rising over Concord. British soldiers were burning captured military material, and a nearby building caught fire before soldiers helped extinguish it. The provincials could not see that distinction from their position. Their officers decided to move toward the bridge and town. Colonel Barrett ordered them not to fire unless fired upon. Major John Buttrick and Lieutenant Colonel John Robinson led the column, with Captain Isaac Davis and the Acton Minute Company near its front. The movement placed Lorry in a worsening position. His 3 companies had already yielded the high ground northwest of the bridge. Now about 96 regulars faced roughly 400 provincials, advancing down a narrow causeway. Lorry tried to form a street-firing column on the east side of the river, but contradictory commands and the confined road produced disorder. At approximately 9:30, several British shots struck the water. A larger volley followed. Captain Davis and Private Abner Hosmer of Acton were killed, and several others were wounded. Buttrick ordered a return fire. 3 British soldiers were killed or mortally wounded and others were hit. The Exchange lasted seconds, but it created the day's first organized provincial fire delivered on command against royal troops. Laurie's companies fell back toward Concord Center. Some provincials crossed the bridge in pursuit, then stopped when British grenadiers approached in support. For a time, the two forces faced one another without renewing the engagement. The companies returning from Barrett's farm were allowed to cross the bridge and rejoin Smith. This pause matters. Neither side was yet directing a unified battle across the countryside. Local companies made decisions in response to what they could see, while Smith concentrated his separated detachments and prepared to leave. Around noon, the British began the return march. Smith still had a coherent military force, and he arranged it according to accepted practice. An advance guard moved ahead of the main body. A rear guard protected the back. Light infantry companies worked as flankers on both sides, searching woods, walls, houses and folds in the ground from which militia might fire. The column itself extended for nearly a third of a mile. This formation was designed to prevent a road-bound body from being surprised. It worked whenever the flankers could stay outside the road, occupy useful ground and force opponents to keep their distance. The weakness appeared at Merriam's Corner, just east of Concord Center. The road narrowed at a small bridge over a brook, requiring the flank guard to draw inward. Militia from Reading, Chelmsford and Billerica had arrived from the north and used the houses, barns and walls near the junction. As the regulars crossed the confined ground, firing began. The British answered and pushed through, but the action established a pattern that would recur. A bridge, bend, wall, or steep slope could interrupt the protective screen. Militia could then approach, fire, and move toward another position while the column continued east. This was not a simple line of farmers standing safely behind one endless stone wall. British light infantry contested hills, orchards, and field edges. They drove militia away from some positions and protected the main body at considerable cost. The regulars also fired volleys whenever opponents gathered within range. Yet the militia did not have to hold ground permanently. Their purpose was to keep pressure on the column, then withdraw before flankers could close. New companies arrived as others paused, reorganized, or ran out of ammunition. The British had one force and one route. The provincials had many local forces and a web of roads feeding the fight. The landscape made that difference visible. The Bay Road crossed open pasture, small meadows, woodlots, orchards, stone walls and rail fences. It descended into stream valleys and climbed ridges. At Brooks Hill and Elmbrook, the road passed another bridge and entered a sharp S-shaped turn later known as the Bloody Angle. Companies from Woburn, led by Major Loamy Baldwin, used the high ground and orchard cover. They fired, shifted position, and fired again as the British vanguard, main body and rear guard entered different parts of the bend. At such places, no commander could protect every element at once. If flankers moved far from the road to clear a ridge, they spent energy and risked separation. If they closed on the column to cross a stream or fence, militia gained room to approach. If the main body stopped to deploy, pressure accumulated from the rear. If it kept moving, wounded and exhausted men fell behind. The regulars retained the ability to break through each local engagement. The cost was paid in ammunition, cohesion, and the physical strength of the specialized troops who had to climb, scatter, reform, and repeat the process. Near the Lincoln and Lexington boundary, Captain Parker's company returned to the fight. Modern archaeology places this action on a wooded, boulder-strewn ridge overlooking a small bridge and the road. The position offered cover, a field of fire, and an escape route that made it difficult for British flankers to trap the militia. Parker's men fired as regulars deployed off the road, then withdrew northeast toward Lexington. This was not the emotional revenge scene sometimes created in later retellings. It was a more controlled use of ground by men who had learned at painful cost that morning not to remain exposed before trained infantry. The road ahead offered no recovery. At the Bloody Bluff and Norick Hill, the British rear guard used high ground to delay pursuers while the head of the column continued east. Provincial fire came from scattered trees, fence rails, walls, and farm buildings. The regulars answered, cleared positions, and moved again. Officers were especially exposed because they had to remain visible while directing formations. Smith was wounded in the leg. Other officers and many enlisted men had also been hit. The column's structure still existed, but its margin for error was disappearing. By the time the leading troops approached Lexington, the original expedition had marched through the night, searched Concord, fought at the bridge, and covered miles under intermittent fire. Light infantry companies had performed the hardest movement on both flanks. Ensign Henry de Bernier later described ammunition failing, wounded men struggling to keep pace, and soldiers beginning to run rather than retreat in order. Officers attempted to form the men again and physically blocked the rush forward. This was the crisis posed at the beginning. Not the destruction of the British force, but the loss of enough control that destruction had become possible. Relief arrived because Gage had responded to Smith's early request for support. He ordered the 1st Brigade under Brigadier General Hugh Percy to assemble before dawn. Administrative delay kept the brigade in Boston until about 9 o'clock. Percy then marched with roughly 1,000 men and 2 6-pounder field guns. His ammunition wagons lagged behind and were attacked in Menotomy, depriving him of supplies he expected to have. Even so, the brigade reached the heights east of Lexington at about 3 o'clock, just when Smith's troops most needed a protected position. Percy placed his brigade across the road and used the guns to check the provincial pursuit. Cannon fire damaged the Lexington meeting house and forced militia away from the immediate approach. Smith's men passed behind the fresh line, where they received a short rest and attention for the wounded. The tactical balance changed at once. The British force now numbered more than 1,700, and the artillery could reach beyond musket range. Yet Percy had not ended the danger. He had stabilized a column still many miles from safety, with limited replacement ammunition and militia gathering along the route ahead. When the march resumed around 3:30, Percy reorganized the force for survival. The exhausted grenadiers and light infantry of Smith's expedition moved near the front, the safer position. Fresh troops protected the flanks and rear. The 23rd Royal Welsh Fusiliers took the rear guard duty. Lieutenant Frederick Mackenzie described marksmen occupying walls and cover, then retiring by files to new high ground. It was disciplined work, designed to prevent pursuers from closing on the column. The method bought space, but it also meant that the rear guard repeatedly stopped, faced west, and withdrew while the rest of the army moved east. Provincial leadership also became more coordinated after Lexington. Massachusetts Militia General William Heath and Dr. Joseph Warren joined the field and helped direct arriving companies. Their control was never complete. Town units still followed their own officers, and the fighting remained dispersed. Nevertheless, Heath could guide forces toward threatened roads and crossings. Percy now faced not only the militia that had followed Smith from Concord, but also companies approaching from communities closer to Boston. The return route entered a more densely settled landscape, giving both sides more cover and creating greater danger for residents and soldiers alike. Menotomy, now Arlington, was the most destructive section of the day. Houses, shops, barns, taverns, walls, and small fields lined the road. Militia used some buildings and walls as firing positions. British flankers moved behind those positions and sometimes caught defenders between the main column and troops off the road. Fighting occurred at short range, and regulars entered buildings from which they believed shots had been fired. 25 provincial soldiers and civilians were killed in Menotomy, while local histories count about 40 British dead there. Those figures make the village the deadliest community along the April 19 route, although exact totals for individual clashes remain less certain. The Jason Russell house became the best-known site within that larger fight. Russell had sent his family away, but remained near his home. Militiamen from several towns gathered around the property as the British approached. When flankers appeared behind them, some provincials ran into the house and cellar. 11 men were killed in the house and yard, including Ross, and 2 British soldiers also died there, according to the Arlington Historical Society. The event should not be reduced to a theatrical room-by-room legend. Its tactical meaning is clear enough. In a settled area, cover could become a trap when Percy's flankers moved beyond it. The violence at Menotomy also destroys the comforting idea that the running battle was clean or one-sided. Militia fire from houses exposed occupants and property to retaliation. British soldiers, angered by attacks from concealed positions, killed people inside buildings and damaged homes. Civilians tried to escape a corridor that had become a battlefield. Neither the provincial method nor the British response can be understood through later romantic images alone. The closer the column came to Boston, the more the military geometry of road, house, wall and flank compressed combat into inhabited space. Beyond Menotomy, the column crossed into Cambridge, while ammunition continued to decline. The field guns were used at intervals, then became less useful as their available rounds diminished. Heath had ordered militia to obstruct the bridge on the more direct road through Cambridge toward Roxbury. At a junction, Percy chose the left-hand route toward Charlestown instead of continuing southeast toward that blocked crossing. The turn shortened his path to defensible high ground and temporarily disrupted parts of the pursuit. It was a practical route decision made with the enemy, the map, and the condition of his force all in view. One final danger developed near Prospect Hill and Winter Hill. Essex County Militia under Colonel Timothy Pickering approached from the north as the British moved toward the narrow Charlestown neck. Had that force arrived sooner and attacked in coordination with units pressing from the west and south, Percy's flank and route might have been in greater danger. Pickering later maintained that he received instructions not to engage. Heath denied sending such an order. The evidence does not justify a confident explanation. What matters is that the threatened interception did not occur before the column passed. Around 7:30, the last British troops crossed the neck and formed a strong position on the heights at Charlestown. Provincial commanders ended the pursuit rather than attack that position under the protection of fresh troops and naval guns. Boats carried British wounded and exhausted soldiers back across the Charles through the night and the following day. The expedition had reached safety, but not because resistance had collapsed. It survived because Percy's brigade arrived at the critical hour, restored a defensible formation, and chose a viable final route. The cost reveals the scale of the day without explaining it by itself. Across the entire action, British losses totaled 73 killed, 174 wounded, and 26 missing, 273 casualties. Provincial losses totaled 49 killed, 41 wounded, and 5 missing, 95 casualties. About 1,700 British regulars and more than 4,000 militia took part at some point, but most were not present together in one set-piece formation. The fight stretched roughly 16 miles along the road and consisted of distinct encounters linked by movement. Those numbers also correct two persistent simplifications. The provincials did not win because every farmer was an exceptional marksman. Thousands of men firing over many hours inflicted serious losses, but not the destruction that legend might imply. Nor did the regulars simply flee all the way from Concord. Their advance guard, flankers, main body, and rear guard repeatedly fought through difficult positions. Discipline failed locally near Lexington, then was restored by reinforcement. The British tactical system worked often enough to save the column. The American advantage was that the same system had to keep working without relief across every mile. The raid's operational result was therefore mixed but unfavorable to gauge. British parties destroyed some supplies in Concord, yet most important stores escaped seizure. The troops returned to the Boston area, but at a cost approaching 1 casualty for every 6 regulars engaged during the day. The mission also demonstrated that control of Boston did not mean control of the Massachusetts countryside. A force could march out, but its return depended on timing, road access, ammunition, and the ability to prevent town after town from joining the fight. The provincial achievement was likewise more specific than later national mythology suggests. On April 19, the colonies did not yet possess a continental army, a declaration of independence, or a unified plan for a long war. What Massachusetts had was an alarm network, local military organization, stores prepared in advance, and men able to converge without waiting for one central command. At North Bridge, officers converted that mobilization into an ordered advance. On Battle Road, local knowledge and repeated pressure turned a professional withdrawal into an exhausting defensive operation. Within a week, about 20,000 New England militia had answered the alarm, and thousands gathered around Boston. The loose concentration became the beginning of the siege. In May, the Second Continental Congress met in Philadelphia amid a crisis now defined by open combat. In June, the fighting at Bunker Hill showed again that British regulars could take ground, but only at a high price. These later events were not mechanically caused by a single volley at Lexington or Concord. They grew from decisions already underway, accelerated by the fact that royal and provincial forces had killed one another in the field. Percy also carried away a more sober estimate of his opponents. In a letter written after the battle, he warned that anyone who regarded them as merely an irregular mob would be mistaken, adding that some knew very well what they were doing. His judgment does not turn every militia action into a master plan. It recognizes something more important. The provincial forces combined veterans, trained minute companies, ordinary militia, imperfect coordination, and intimate knowledge of local routes. Their effectiveness came from that mixture, not from a single heroic type. The original question can now be answered. Smith's expedition nearly broke down because a raid designed around secrecy and speed lost both before reaching its objective. The alarm network bought time for supplies to be moved and militia to assemble. North Bridge transformed a search operation into an armed withdrawal. Along the Bay Road, terrain repeatedly forced British flankers inward, while new provincial companies arrived from several directions. Fatigue, wounds, and ammunition loss then compounded each earlier problem. Percy prevented defeat, but he could not restore the political situation that existed before the march. That is the durable significance of Lexington, Concord, and Battle Road. The day did not decide the American Revolution, and neither side yet understood the conflict's final scale. It did prove that Massachusetts could mobilize thousands, sustain resistance across a long corridor, and contain the British garrison after the troops returned. For Britain, the expedition exposed the limits of a powerful army operating beyond its secure base. For the colonists, it made rebellion irreversible in practice before independence had been declared in words.